Okay. Welcome, everybody, and thank you for joining us here today with Massachusetts for Safe Technology, Safer Tech Education. And also, we have with us a wonderful co-host today, Patti Wood, who's one of my heroes. I know that I stand on the shoulders of giants for those who have started in this kind of work long before I did. And Patti is one of those who has been working tirelessly for decades on trying to protect our kids and others from environmental exposures. Patti and her husband, Doug, head up a grassroots organization
Morning.
that is aptly
I
named
just tried to call, but
Grassroots
your phone didn't
Environmental
work.
Education. I'll ask everybody who's not speaking to
How's it
please
going?
mute themselves. David, we're picking up a little bit of feed from you, although it's lovely to have you with us. I'll go ahead and see if I can mute a few of you here, but if you could go ahead and mute yourselves, that would be very helpful. So let me turn it over to Patti, and she can give us an overview of the work that she and Doug are doing over at Grassroots Environmental Education with several projects that they have founded over the years. The first one that I knew about was the BabySafe Project, and then they went and set up the Americans for Responsible Technology. And more recently, they have put up the Tech Safe Schools website. So Patti, tell us a little bit about each of those projects.
Okay, so first of all, welcome everyone. I give it to Cece to to just continue on her crusade to educate as many people as possible about this ubiquitous exposure that's occurring all over the world actually now. So we would like to, hopefully give you a few new thoughts today because we're involved in some other issues around radio frequency radiation or microwave radiation. But as Cece said, we have these three projects, but they are part of a larger organization which we run, which is a nonprofit called Grassroots Environmental Education, where we have a mission to educate the public about the links between common environmental exposures and human health. And we focus a lot on children because they are more vulnerable, just because of their developing physiology and because of their typical behaviors, which are in many cases unlike adults. And unfortunately, because children are learning about their world in a very hands-on way, which is what they're supposed to do, they are more exposed than adults to many different types of environmental toxins. So I can tell you a little bit about the BabySafe project, which we started based on the work of Hugh Taylor, who is the head of reproductive science as an OBGYN at Yale Medical School. And we had heard him speak at a conference about a recent study that he and his colleagues had conducted. It was a very simple study. They were actually looking for tumor growth, and they were using mice that were in controlled environments, one that had a cell phone, an active cell phone on top of their cage, and the other had the cell phone turned off, was also on top of the cage, but was turned off. And they found that the offspring of these pregnant mice, which were in the cage, okay, the offspring of these pregnant mice were very, very different depending on whether they were exposed or not. And so what they saw was actually not tumor growth, but they saw neurological behavior problems. And they also saw that there was a difference in the normal development of the prefrontal cortex in the brains of the exposed offspring. And so based on that and the excitement of hearing this, we decided to just warn pregnant women about not putting cell phones in their pockets over their developing babies. And it was a really simple thing. I mean, pregnant women were already concerned. They weren't having soft cheeses for lunch. They were avoiding tuna fish sandwiches. They were not smoking or drinking. And so this was just another very simple thing to do, would be to keep that cell phone away from their developing baby. And so that was actually a really good project. We actually developed a joint statement for OBGYNs and other related professions in the medical field, or professionals in the medical field, to sign on to the statement. We have almost 500 signatories at the moment. And then we put out a pamphlet which I wrote, which is now in its third edition right now, and we are translating it into, I think, 7 languages right now, actively being used by the French OBGYN Society, Germany, the Netherlands, and Belgium, Cyprus. We can translate it into any language, but we like to have a professional organization who can actually utilize this information with their patients and within their societies in their countries. So that's what we're doing with the BabySafe project, and that has really grown. I just got 3 orders this morning. We're shipping them out to OBGYNs, to conferences, to midwives, doulas, and they are providing this information to their patients. We just started working with someone in Los Angeles who is very connected to the Hispanic community, and she's translating everything, not just the pamphlet, but everything about the BabySafe project into Spanish, and working through a network across the country to get that out. The Americans for Responsible Technology is kind of an umbrella organization. We have many organizations from almost all 50 states that are working on the placement of cell phone towers, especially, but everything else that involves this type of radiation exposure. And so we have a lot of information on that site, especially for people who would like to work with their local municipalities to get them to either not place cell phone towers in communities, or to actually place them in remote areas and never in front of people's homes or in front of schools or on school properties, et cetera, et cetera. That's a real resource for information. The Americans for Responsible Tech.org. And then the last thing that we started, which was actually not so recently, but was the Tech Safe Schools, because we realized that tech-based learning was just everywhere. Teachers today spend very little time in their classrooms without children being on computers or tablets. All classrooms have routers. They have whiteboards. They have other, equipment in the classroom that is operating wirelessly. We know that the routers that are sent from the factories are sent at their highest, the highest level. And so you can actually turn down, one of the things you can do that's so incredibly simple is just to turn down the amount of power, the output on these routers way down, in some cases like 90% less than the way it has come from the factory, and the kids are still able to access the internet and be on their tech-based learning programs. So that program, as part of our wireless work, as everything, is a science-based program. So on the website, which is techsafeschools.org, you can find a lot of information about the science, the neurological impacts, the impacts to different organs in the body, cardiovascular risks. It goes on and on and on. And I'm sure that you have learned quite a bit about this from Cece already. But that's the core, is that we know that there is harm, right? And the harm is confirmed by peer-reviewed academic research, which is a very active area of scientific research right now around the world. And so we are able to access these studies and put them up where they are relevant across all of our programs. Mitigation techniques is also something that you can find on the TechSafe Schools site, starting with a meter where you can actually take readings prior to making adjustments or mitigating the amount of radiation in the classroom, as well as other more technical things that would be useful to an IT technician in the school environment. And then there's a lot of information and resources for parents, for teachers, and so on. When we started in this area of tech-based learning in schools, we had an opportunity to meet with NYSET, which is the New York State United Teachers. It's the largest teachers union in the country. And we had several meetings with them, and I spoke at a couple of their conferences, and they actually put out a resolution in 2017 basically saying that they want to replace wireless technologies with wired technologies in classrooms. It would be the safest thing for students and teachers and staff alike. And so here is their resolution, and we would love to see a resolution like this in every state in the United States, okay, by the teachers. And then actually implement it. And the implementation is where many, many things fall down and fall apart and don't happen. And that's something that I have to give Cece a lot of credit for, is that she doesn't give up. And we continue to have this conversation, and we will continue to do that as well, as long as we can.
Oh, Patti, thank you so much. Again, I am just so inspired by everything you and Deb have done, and your team. I know that you've got a wonderful group of other professionals that work very closely with you on all of these projects. So hats off to all of you. For the next hour and a half or so, we're going to go through a presentation, and we will send that out to everybody who's registered afterwards. We always say, don't take our word on any of this. If this is a new subject for you, go poke around in my slides when you receive them, and it will get you to all the wonderful resources that Patti and Deb have developed, as well as the science and things that are happening politically. So again, know it for yourself, because once you really understand, then I think you will have a resolve to do something to protect first yourself and your loved ones, and then in time, perhaps your community. So with that, I am going to launch my screen share. And Patti, can you give me a nod when you can see my screen?
I can see your screen.
Okay, great. Thank you so much. So these are my slides. And again, we will send this out to everybody who registered. And I'll start with a little bit of background on how I fell down the rabbit hole with this issue. And then we'll start talking about the science and the risks, why we don't know about this issue through mainstream media, and most importantly, what solutions exist. And I'm so excited, because when I fell down the rabbit hole with this issue over 10 years ago now, I didn't have anybody I could talk to for the first 2 years. I was just doing the deep dive on my own. And that MTPW after my name just means that I had the privilege of earning a master's in technical and professional writing from Northeastern University, which is where I also earned my undergraduate degree in communications. And I will tell you, never in a million years did I imagine this is where I would be applying my skill set, but I'm so grateful. I also am the youngest of 10 children, so I popped out of the womb having to deal with a lot of different personalities. So I had to think on my feet as a survival skill from the wee little years. So let me tell you how I got really involved in this. So when my kids were in school, they're both young women in their late 20s now, we kept hearing about this 21st century classroom and how our kids were going to need to have all this amazing technology to be able to succeed in the world. So, good doobie parents, we jumped in when we kept hearing about wireless infrastructure and equipment that our local budget could not afford. So I started doing fundraising to bring in iPads and Chromebooks and smart boards and minis. And then one night at book group, a girlfriend of mine who's an electrical engineer tipped us off that there could be biological effects from wireless radiation. And it was book group, so I just kind of made a mental note of it. And then not long after that, I learned that the American Academy of Environmental Medicine, now these are the doctors who get the conundrum cases that regular doctors haven't been trained on, things that have come up from exposures in the environment. So this American Academy of Environmental Medicine back in 2012 put out a position statement to school superintendents saying, please do not let wireless into the classrooms. And I thought, wow, what's this? So that's where my journey began. I thought, I wonder if there's any science to this. And I was astounded to find literally thousands of peer-reviewed studies from all over the world showing extensive harm. And we're going to walk you through the high level of the science on this today. So it was not an easy conversation to have with my schools, because by this point in time, they had been told that they're falling behind if they don't have all this wireless technology. We found out that industry got in at the state level and started embedding technology into the curriculum. So it was no easy conversation, and I'm very proud of my town, Ashland Public Schools in Massachusetts, for even becoming the first in the nation to have this little sign hanging in our classroom with best practices for mobile devices. Turn off these devices when not in use, turn on the Wi-Fi only when you need it, and always place the mobile device on a solid surface, not your body. And we'll tell you more about that in a moment too. And when I was a little kid, and if I walked up and just stood in front of the television, I could still hear my mother's voice going, Cece, stand back. You're too close to that TV. And what she understood back then is that our bodies have their own electromagnetic field. And with a lot of these man-made energies or technologies, that's much greater than what our bodies can handle. So Mom was right. We shouldn't be close to anything that's emitting a man-made electromagnetic field. So we became the first in the nation to even have this little sign hanging in all of our classrooms. But I soon discovered it's just a sign. And like Patti said, with the unions that she's worked so hard with in the state of New York, we have these things on paper, but we haven't found the courage to actually step up and truly protect the children and the faculty and the staff in our schools. So we're going to invite you to participate in some other programs we've got going later in our presentation today. So I went to my state senator, Karen Spilka, and she and I had worked together on our local education foundation running these campaigns. And I brought the science to her. I brought a radiation detection meter to show her. And I brought Ashland's little sign. And when I measured Senator Spilka's cell phone and her district director's laptop, both devices went right off the charts with radiation. And they're looking at me like, really? And I said, yes. And nobody knows. Is there something we can do from where you sit to at least give the public the right to know, like we ultimately did with tobacco products and pornography and gambling and alcohol, all these highly addictive things that people will consume? Wireless radiation is now one of them. So Senator Spilka put me together with an attorney in her office. And at that time, she was the chairwoman of the Senate Ways and Means Committee. And attorney Aaron Carty and I whittled out a little bill that would just bring the right minds together at the state level and look at this issue and then decide what needs to be done. Well, we got started with that 10 years ago. And although we've had more than 20 bills filed in a given session, we have never gotten any further than having it reported out of the first committee, and then it dies at the end of the session. So I think that in Massachusetts, we are deep in bed with industry. And we had the same conversation, though, in New Hampshire. And long story short, within 7 months, we got a bill passed into law to form a commission that would spend 1 year investigating this issue, and they did. We got that bill passed in 7 months' time, and we're going to teach you more about that. So somewhere along the line, somebody over in Europe was realizing that we can't fix this until we can teach people about it. So Brett and Lynn West in the United Kingdom at the time founded a little nonprofit, and they reached out to Dr. Deborah Davis, who's the Nobel Peace Prize co-laureate on climate change. She is the director or the uh, president emeritus of the Environmental Health Trust, which is arguably the world's greatest database on this topic. And somebody in Europe had contacted her and said, hey, can we reference the Environmental Health Trust and include it in what we're building out? She said, absolutely. And you might want to contact this woman, Cece Doucette, who's made some inroads with her schools and with legislation. And then she also introduced them to Dr. Mikko Ahonen in Finland. He's one of the world's scientists who investigates wireless radiation and the biological effects. So we had this amazing little period of 6 months or so where Mikko, Brett, Lynn, and I all were able to take time and build out an online course. And our first nonprofit was called Wireless Education, and we're rebranding right now because we really want to take the focus off of wireless and really put it back on what is safe technology. So we literally have an off-the-shelf course that can be completed in about an hour online that could train your entire workforce, it could train your entire municipality, and it could train your entire schools literally in about an hour online. And it provides a handy tip sheet that you can print out at the end, along with a certificate of compliance that you can give to your human resource department to confirm that you took the course and you passed the course. But again, it only takes about an hour to do. So we have so many incredible resources today that we didn't have a decade ago when I fell down the rabbit hole with this. And then when I was preparing for the bills at the State House, a woman named Patricia Burke contacted me from Massachusetts and said, there's going to be a panel at the State House giving a presentation with world-leading experts on this topic. And I was like, wow. Because for the first 2 years, literally, I had nobody else I could talk to about this. So I went down to the State House for this presentation that was asking for right-to-know legislation that Dr. Deborah Davis, who's this Nobel Peace Prize co-laureate, she brought with her Frank Clegg, who's the retired president of Microsoft Canada. And I'm sitting there in this room at the State House going, wow, there's a captain of industry telling us that wireless technology is not safe, that the Federal Communications Commission's guidelines on man-made radiation is not protecting us, nor is Canada's Safety Code 6. And so I was just astounded. First, we have this world-leading scientist. Now we've got a captain of industry. Also, who came in was Dr. Sharma from India, and he was in the Indian government, and it was his responsibility to help form the public radiation exposure limits. And he had done some of the studies that showed harm, especially on the sperm. And so he had taken where our current guidelines still reside way up here. And at least on paper, Dr. Sharma in India was able to bring it down for his government about 90%. They're still in the throes of figuring out how to make that actually workable. But it showed that with some political will, we can actually make important inroads on this. So having been there at the State House in a standing room only presentation, I was able to connect with others. And so over the next couple of years, we formed Massachusetts for Safe Technology. And I provide you with all the links as noted in the blue underline here, so that you can go pound around and really look at what the science is telling us and then what the solutions are. So please feel free. Others have reached out to me across the country and said, hey, I like your website. Do you mind if we copy it? I'm a big fan of let's not reinvent the wheel. If anything that we have done can help you to help your community, please just reach out and let us know. Then somebody down at the National Institutes of Health found my work. And by this time, I'm feeling kind of like the Forrest Gump of this journey here, because I'm not a doctor, I'm not a scientist, but I am well educated, I have children, and I care greatly about the health of all of our children. So somebody down at the NIH found my work and asked me to co-chair the technology panel for the Health in Buildings Roundtable Conference. And we were allowed, each of us, I think about 8 minutes to say what we came to say. And I gave the opening remarks. And then we had Frank Clegg flew in on his own time and dime to tell us that with a nudge, the industry can absolutely do better, but they're making it hand over fist right now. So why would they change it unless the public starts speaking up? And that's what we hope to inspire today. So we also had Peter Sullivan join our panel, and I had found Peter Sullivan's work when I was doing my investigation, and I came across a lecture that he gave online. Now, Peter, before he went to work for Silicon Valley as an engineer, where his friends were like the guys who invented cell phones, Peter had been a fighter pilot, so kind of like Top Gun, and he was up there in the fighter planes way up high with the very high natural levels of radiation inside of a plane that had radar all over it, because that's where this wireless technology originated, was in our militaries as radar for military weaponry. And then he's inside the cockpit with all this additional exposure with all the equipment that can then communicate back down to the ground, or the terrestrial, they call the ground, I guess. So Peter's health some years later started crashing, and he couldn't figure out what was going on. He was losing a very unhealthy amount of weight. His teeth started getting brittle. And when his 2 little boys each came up through the preschool years, both of his sons were diagnosed on the autism spectrum. And Peter did what a lot of families will do. They will start removing all of the environmental pollutants that they know about, like the toxic chemicals in our food stream. He went so far as to do the heavy metal detox to pull all the heavy metals out of our sensitive organs. And today he will tell families, those are all important, but the first thing I would recommend is to do the digital detox. Shut everything off at night for at least 12 hours and see what happens. And we never want to overpromise, because we know that every person's body is physiologically different. It's genetically different. So we don't want to overpromise, but we will tell you that when people do that big, courageous step of protecting the sleep and creating a sleep sanctuary, we hear incredible reports of recovery. Both of Peter's sons are now grown men, and neither of them is on the autism spectrum any longer. And I was like, wow, I didn't even know that was an option. But Peter teaches us there's something called de novo mutations, which means it didn't come from mom's bloodline, it didn't come from dad's bloodline. The disconnect in the body somewhere came from the environment. So once you start cleaning up the environment, we see huge, huge improvements for many people. So I like to include this link for the NIH because, one, it comes off as being highly credible, and two, our talks are very short. So if you want to send this off, know your audience, know who's going to be impressed by which line of communication here. So that's a really good one. And then one of the major gaps that we had when I was trying to come up to speed on all of this is that we could tell that so many people were developing these sicknesses, and yet there was no way to get training to our healthcare practitioners. So back in 2019, Dr. Lynn Patrick held the first medical conference in honor of Dr. Bill Ray, who was one of the founding fathers of environmental medicine. And as he was building out his environmental medicine practice and aged up, one of his lasting wishes was that we could put together a medical conference and train doctors and nurses and first responders and, you know, school therapists, everybody who's working in the health space. So Dr. Lynn Patrick did the first medical conference in 2019, and then Elizabeth Kelly, who holds a master's in public health and helped the Americans with Disabilities Act recognize radiofrequency radiation as a biological risk a couple of decades ago. Libby picked up the reins again and expanded out and built out this EMF medical conference back in 2021. And just a little bit of glossary terms here and the little alphabet soup that we swim around in. So EMF stands for electromagnetic fields. Now, the Earth has its own electromagnetic field, and there's a scientist named Schumann who figured out how often does the Earth pulse this beautiful healing energy. And it was eventually coined as Schumann's resonance. And he found that the Earth pulses this beautiful energy 7.83 times per second, or 7.83 hertz. That's the second cycle there. Well, when we got so fancy with this man-made technology in the megahertz range, mega means millions. So here we're meant to be in sync with the Earth at 7.83 times per second. And in the megahertz range that's operating a lot of our routers, our cell phones, and other wireless technology, that's in the, when we say megahertz, that means a million. So 1 million times per second, we are getting pulsed with man-made microwave radiation in this spiked erratic signal. In the gigahertz range that's now being deployed, giga means a billion. How they can fit a billion of anything into 1 second, that's way beyond my scope. But we are literally bombarding ourselves a billion times per second with microwave radiation. And so we talk about EMFs being electromagnetic fields. We talk about radio frequency radiation. Those are the pulsations of microwaves. Sometimes it's called microwave radiation because it is in the microwave segment of something called the electromagnetic spectrum. And we don't have to get real technical on that, but just know that when we talk about wireless, when we talk about man-made EMFs, when we talk about radio frequency radiation or microwave radiation, it's kind of all part of the same kit and caboodle here. So the bad news is that we were about to go to this medical conference when COVID hit and everybody went into lockdown. The good news is that we had to pivot, and Libby hired a company that could come in and record all of the lectures. And there were 24.5 accredited continuing medical education credits that were available up through last year, July. Once the accreditation period expired, then Libby took the entire conference and put it online for you and for your healthcare practitioners and for the fire and the police first responders in your community and for the healthcare professionals in your school district. Everybody can now get professionally trained at no charge by going to the EMF Medical Conference. And I helped Libby create a list with direct links to every single lecture, every panel discussion from that conference so that you can click directly on Vimeo or YouTube. And maybe there's a 20-minute lecture you want to watch. Maybe there's an hour lecture or a 40-minute lecture, but you can just slot these into your calendar and digest this at your own pace on your own time. And our firefighters love this because they often don't have budget, but they need to be trained because people will get sick, call for help. And if they don't know about electromagnetic illnesses, all too often we hear that they get shot into a psych ward instead of getting the biological help that they need. So this has been my journey, and this is where it brings us to today. And I want to share a little bit now about how my schools became the first in the nation to even have this little sign hanging in our classrooms with precautionary measures. I think it was when they read the legal fine print. So for anybody who's with us today that has an iPhone, I invite you right now to take it out and go into settings. And for anybody who uses a different kind of phone, like a Google or an Android, if you look up your make and model and type in RF exposure, you'll find similar information. But from an iPhone, and our friends at the Environmental Health Trust have this webpage called See the Fine Print. It's not just in our phones. It's been in all of our wireless device disclaimers all along. The iPad, for example, had a disclaimer in there saying, yeah, this could cause seizures and blackouts and eye strain. So the industry has known, but they've buried it, and it's high time we know so that we have a choice in how we access our technology. So in the iPhone, from settings, go down just a little ways and hit general. From general, go all the way down to the bottom and hit legal and regulatory. So settings, general, legal and regulatory, and then about 4 down on that next menu, right at the top there, you'll see RF exposure. And when we read the legal fine print that's been buried in there all along, it tells us a couple of really important things. One, this device was tested at a distance from the body. So if you are putting in your suit pocket or your shirt pocket or your bra, if you're tucking it in your waistband, if you're putting it in your back pocket, you are exceeding the government guidelines for public radiation exposure. And as we'll discuss momentarily, those were never biologically safety tested, and the Federal Communications Commission has now been sued for ignoring 11,000 pages of evidence of harm. So there's no cavalry coming. The courts and the industry will drag this out for years and years. And in the meantime, so many adults and children and pollinators are getting very sick, and they have no idea to even consider whether this could be a factor. But hey, they're good guys, right? So while you're reading that legal fine print, if you go down another paragraph or so, you'll say, it says, to reduce your exposure, basically, once you know you're being radiated, don't touch it. It says to use a hands-free option like the speakerphone or the headset that came with your device. And I'm going to put a pause on my screen share right now and give you a demonstration. So please know, for everything that we have broken, there is a solution. And when we talk about those headsets, a couple words of advice there. One is, stay away from the earbuds. You're putting a microwave radiation transmitter on both sides of your brain that is sending microwave radiation across your brain, but also to wherever your device is. So a better option, if you have to use a headset with something that is active, look for something called a hollow tube or an air tube headset. Look at that, just rubber tips that would go and hook on. They're connected to these little ferrite beads that break the radiation, and then you've got a nice long cord so you can set the radiating device far away from you instead of leaving it on your body. The U.S. Centers for Disease Control and Prevention already have some guidelines around ionizing radiation. That's the kind that can break the atom because it's got so much power. What we're talking about today is non-ionizing radiation, but the principles still apply. The CDC has something called the ALARA principle, as low as reasonably achievable. That's our goal. We don't want to take anybody's toys. We just want you to know there's a safer way to use it. So we're aiming for as low as reasonably achievable. And their three-pronged approach for that is, one, leave yourself in the exposure for as short amount of time as you can. And two, create as much distance, which is why a longer cord to your headset is better. And three, if you can't get away from it, do your very best to shield yourself, which is why we wear that lead apron when we get an X-ray from that ionizing radiation. And there are companies that make shielding products for non-ionizing radiation as well. And we'll leave you with a little bit of information on that later. But what I want to do now is to give you a demonstration. It's hard to get our head around something that's invisible, right? So I learned, and this is a radio frequency meter, I learned that we have measurement tools. This is the one that was recommended at the EMF medical conference, and doctors are putting these into their practice and letting their patients take it home and measure, and then come back and they can teach them how to remediate those exposures. So this is a device from a company called Safe Living Technologies, and it's called the Safe and Sound Pro 2. I like this meter because it tells me exactly what the exposure is. It's about $400. And there's a little sister one too that's called the Safe and Sound Classic that's about half that cost. So some people will go in together, buy one. Somebody might be able to buy it outright, but it's really important to measure this, because without knowing what your exposures are, with 5G and the Internet of Things, the industry is forecasting that we're going to have 200 wireless devices connected up to the Internet of Things in our homes if we don't know any better. So it's really important to measure. So I'll give you a demonstration here. See how it's blinking green? That's the best. In the scientific literature, they want us to be at 10 or less on the maximum spike of radiation that's going through the air. The unit of measurement is something called a microwatt per square meter. So basically, in like 3 feet of air, how much radiation, man-made, is penetrating in your space. Right now, I'm at a 3. And I circled my tail for a while because I didn't want to know any of this, and I certainly didn't want to believe it. But I said, okay, girl, you got to step up. You're the mom. It's your job to protect your family. So one by one, I found all my exposures and I turned them off. And here's what happens. We went from flashing green to flashing red, which is the very worst. And all the different antennas in this device have come online. And I'll walk you through that in a second. But I'm going to stop radiating myself here. And watch it, it dissipates and goes way down again, right? But it held on to the highest reading. So we were at 3. Science wants us to be at 10 or less. And we just went to 2,240,000 microwatts per square meter. 2 million from one device. And we want to be at 10, not 10,000, but just 10. So that's what we've done to ourselves. So I want to just share a little bit about this. So as a rule, I keep my device in airplane mode. I can forward my cell phone calls to my landline. And I know industry talked a lot of people out of getting rid of their landline, but it doesn't cost that much to get it back. I would highly recommend you not use a mobile device unless you're on the go. And at that, only use the one antenna that you need for the shortest amount of time. Who knew? My old iPhone 7 has about 6 different antennas. We've got cellular and data, Bluetooth, Wi-Fi, locator, hotspot. And for anybody who didn't know any better and upgraded to a 5G phone, there's a whole array of additional antennas mounted in there. So again, you are now empowered to go into your settings and go, oh, I'm not using it right now. I'll put it in airplane mode. And then if it says Bluetooth on or not connected, or Wi-Fi on or not connected, neither one of those settings is good because it's two-way microwave radiation. So if it says it's not connected, it means it's still pulsing that radiation to find a connection. So just hit it and then turn it off. And then measure if you can and make sure you got it all. So that's what we're up against. I'm going to go ahead and resume my screen share. And again, for everything that we've broken, we know how to fix. So I went after a grant and it wasn't easy. Again, I had to educate from the bottom up. It took me 3 rounds, but ultimately our select board, which is our form of local government, gave me a grant to put a meter on loan in the Ashland Public Library for $400. And then I had to go in and educate the library trustees so that they would agree to accept it into circulation. So we became the first in the nation to have this community device available. So anybody in my town, if they're looking for a new home or they're looking to buy a new car, or they want to check out what's going on, in their own home or their office or their kids' schools, they can just borrow this meter for a week or 2, go get their data, and then one by one start addressing the exposures. And now we are getting word that all around the country, people like this idea. And it's not a hard sell today for your libraries because most libraries are having to reinvent themselves. And they all have a library of things now. Like my daughter was waiting for a power washer to borrow from her library. They have games, disc golf, all sorts of great things you can borrow from your library now. And now it's easy enough to ask them to please put a good radio frequency detection meter on loan. We recommend the Safe and Sound Pro 2 today because it has some great features on it. And a couple people reached out and said, oh, our library put in this one that was only $100, and we put the 2 meters up against each other, and the cheaper one was missing some of the signals, so it could give you a false sense of security. So if you can, get a good one. And if your library says, gosh, we can only afford maybe a couple hundred, or we don't have it in the budget this year, reach out to the Environmental Health Trust. They have a small grant fund, and your library has to reach out, not you, but your librarian has to reach out, and they may be able to help you get the funding in your community to get that meter. And one of the last bastions of independent reporting in our country now is our local cable stations. And I want to give a shout out to WACA TV here in Ashland. They've done many public service announcements with me, and they sent somebody to my home with a professional camera, and we did a 23-minute walk through this public service announcement to show what a typical home has today that's radiating. And we showed the microwave oven, we showed the laptops, the printers, what everybody has bought into, and then made suggestions for how to mitigate that to get to as low as reasonably achievable. And I was brought in by Patricia Burke a couple of times to the Worcester, Massachusetts cable station because National Grid was rolling out their smart grid pilot program out there. And so I had been a guest speaker on that program. And one day the station manager reached out and said, Cece, you just need to have your own show on wireless technology. And I thought, well, thank you very much. I would love to. And so I go into the studio every couple of weeks and I invite guests to come. I know Sydney Cox, who's with us today, has been a guest twice for the incredible work that she's done out in California. And this Friday, Patti Wood, who's my co-host today, she and I will be doing a 28-minute episode with more information on the wonderful programs that she and her husband, Doug, have founded. So lots of great information out there. I think we're coming up to episode 40, and they're only 28 minutes, so very easy to watch, and just keep learning with us. All right. So what does the science tell us? We're going to do an overview now on the long-term health effects, and then on the next slide, we'll talk about the short-term health effects. So for many years, the industry got away with saying, maybe it can cause cancer, maybe it can't, but cancer is a long-term endpoint, which gives them 20 years to peddle their toxic products, right? Well, after 20 years of investigating, the U.S. National Toxicology Program, which is arguably the gold standard for toxics research among the best in the world, they concluded a $30 million study. This is the largest study that our government has ever commissioned on any toxin. And at the end of the day, after an unprecedented 3-day peer review at the National Institutes of Health with world-leading scientists who are highly qualified to comment because researching man-made radiofrequency radiation is their life's work, they concluded clear evidence of cancerous tumors and DNA damage. Now, clear evidence is the highest of 5 categories that they can assign. So clear evidence should have triggered public policy, but it didn't, and we'll teach you why in a few minutes. The industry, every time a good study comes out, they'll spin it like, oh, that's just one study, you need more than one study. Well, right on the heels of our $30 million study on cell phones, the Ramazzini Institute in Italy completed another very large multi-million-dollar study on cell towers, or cell phone base stations, as some would call them. And guess what they found? Cancerous tumors, DNA damage, and other findings that we found here in the United States too. So we don't need more science. We need an informed public who will start speaking up on this, because it's not going to come from high above. There are wonderful people working in those areas, but it's not going to happen in time to save your kids and mine. DNA damage. DNA is the roadmap to grow a proper anything, from a child to a plant to a pollinator. And we know scientifically this is damaging the DNA. It was the infertility studies that got me on my feet when I started reading the science. And I learned that they've taken male human sperm and exposed it to a laptop with the antennas radiating. Again, multiple antennas. It changed that DNA. It slowed the motility of the sperm, and it caused far fewer sperm to be viable, or programmed cell death, or apoptosis, as they call it in the science. But it was killing off the sperm in 4 hours of exposure. And I went, you gotta be kidding me. At that point in time, I had just sent my oldest daughter off to college with her MacBook, and where was she using it? But right on top of her reproductive organs. And our youngest had just gone into high school, and we thought we'd give her a leg up. So we gave her a laptop for Christmas. And where, of course, is she using it, but right on top of her reproductive organs. And now Kaiser Permanente and others have come up with incredible studies on women's infertility and the connection to radiating all of our reproductive organs and fetuses. So neurotoxicity, as Patti mentioned in her opening remarks, Dr. Hugh Taylor heads up the OB/GYN program at Yale Medical, and he did some of the rodent studies. And the reason we do these studies on the Sprague Dawley rats and these other mice is because it's unethical and illegal to do them on humans. And yet here we are, perhaps in the midst of the world's biggest experiment when we brought wireless to market with no biological safety testing. But Dr. Taylor at Yale found that when they exposed the pregnant mice and rats to these, or pregnant mice to these cell phone signals, the mice gave birth to these pups that started exhibiting behavior that looked much like a child with ADD, ADHD, bouncing off the walls of the cage, not a care in the world, neurodegeneration. Dr. Martha Herbert founded the Autism Lab at Massachusetts General Hospital. She's now retired, a Harvard pediatric neurologist, but she has seen huge connections between what we know scientifically with microwave radiation exposures and that tipping point that many in her care were getting to and falling into the autism spectrum. Dr. Martin Pall culled the research on Alzheimer's, and he has some really good research papers published. You know, it used to be that we would see Alzheimer's creep up in our 80s or our 90s, and then it started happening in our 70s, and our 60s, our 50s, our 40s, our 30s, and even in some cases in our 20s. And we just simply cannot continue to pollute the environment of the brain with microwave pulsations and expect that we're going to have the same neurological outcomes that we once had before we got into digital technology. And we are so grateful when better known groups in the mainstream start to get funding to put resources toward this topic. And one of those groups that I was familiar with as a mom was the Environmental Working Group. Some of you may know their work because every year they put out a Clean 15 and a Dirty Dozen fact sheet on what's going on with pesticides in our foods and which ones you should try and buy organically, which ones might not be so contaminated because they have protections around the part that we eat. So I already had some good trust with the Environmental Working Group, and then I was just so thrilled that they have now come out with, they have a PhD on staff, and they've come out with fact sheets. So again, know your audience. If you're inclined to share any of this information, know what might resonate with them. I think a lot of people will find some good information. This one is protecting kids from wireless radiation at school and at home. And this one is about the neurotoxicity with our nervous system. And then children are especially vulnerable. They are not just little adults. They're still under construction. Their skulls are much thinner than yours and mine. Their brains have a much higher water content. And we know that this radiation, just like when you put your coffee to heat up in the microwave, it's interacting with that liquid, and kids have a higher water content in their brain. So with great thanks to Dr. Om Gandhi and his colleagues, they did the modeling of how much radiation are we actually absorbing when we put a device up to our heads. So these are the head models at the top of this diagram, turned sideways, and the little yellow dot is the ear. When you put the cell phone up to your skull and mine, we are penetrating our brain with microwave pulsations about a third of the way into it. On a 10-year-old child, it's about 2/3 of the way into that child's brain. And on a 5-year-old child, it's penetrating almost the entire brain. So we can't just sit here and wait for somebody to come fix this. There is no cavalry coming. It's up to you and I to learn about this, to start fixing it in our own homes, our offices, and then start speaking with the communities. Don't go it alone, though, when you go to the community level, and we'll talk a little bit more about that. The science in the short term. The good news is Couple good things. One is, with great thanks to Elizabeth Kelly and her colleagues, years ago, they got the Americans with Disabilities Act through the Jobs Area Network and the Indoor Quality Assurance groups to recognize that electromagnetic illnesses are real. It's not psychosomatic, it's biological. And they already have recommendations for reducing exposures and providing accommodations. So please know that's a very strong resource there. And the good news is that a lot of people are going to start recognizing some of these symptoms, and it doesn't cost you anything to just start taking precautions. And then they'll come back and go, didn't want to know this, didn't want to believe it. My goodness, I recognize some of those symptoms. I took your advice, and step one, I created a sleep sanctuary. And I slept through the night for the first time in years, when we're not bombarding the brain with microwave radiation. Now, again, for many decades, the industry said, oh, there's no mechanism of harm identified. Let's just keep doing what we're doing. Well, we know what's going on with cancer. We know what's going on with infertility. We know what's going on with neurotoxicity. And now we know what's going on with insomnia for a lot of people. You and I are light beings, meaning that we operate off of the light and dark cycle of our circadian rhythm. Well, in the wee hours of darkness, the pineal gland in the brain would release melatonin. Melatonin would go in and regulate your sleep and help to do the cell repair and regeneration and clean up the toxins and escort them out through the bloodstream as waste. What happens when we leave this man-made light, invisible light energy form on all night long? Well, some people are getting to that tipping point where the brain, it can't differentiate between natural daylight and man-made light. So it's over there going, when's it going to get dark so I can release that melatonin? So if we choose to leave these microwave radio frequency emissions pulsating all night, we may find ourselves getting into some trouble with sleep, headaches, stabbing, searing headaches, migraines, nosebleeds, ear bleeds, fatigue. Oh my gosh, where your giddy up and go has just gone. Pain from unidentified sources. Well, we know that there's a whole domino effect. If you're not sleeping right, a lot of things start to fall out of place, right? But we also know about something called rouleau formation. And in my little brain, rouleau sounds a lot like Rolos, which are those little stacked chocolate caramels, Rolo candies. That's how I remember rouleau formation, because remember, we're talking about electromagnetic radiation. And when you look under a microscope, like Dr. Magda Havas has done, and you look at our red blood cells without exposure to radio frequency radiation, they are free-floating, these nice little shaped ovals or circles that bring oxygen through our red blood cells up to all of our organs and tissues and keeps us humming along quite nicely. Then after Dr. Havas exposed the red blood cells to this man-made radiation, she noted a couple of really important things. One is the shape changed. Instead of these nice, smooth-edged red blood cells, they started looking like bottle caps. And then they started magnetizing together. And now you've got this chain like the chocolate Rolos, right? But this chain of deformed blood cells can't get to where they need to go now to bring the oxygen. And so oxidative stress or reactive oxygen species are a couple of things linked to this rouleau formation that are causing us to have a whole lot of symptoms. And then skin abnormalities. Who knew, but we've got little antennas in the surface of our skin. And those little antennas help us to stay safe in our environment. Is it too hot? Is it too cold? Should we go inside? Should we put on another layer? And what happens when we overpower those natural little antennas in our skin with this bombardment of microwave radiation? Some people will talk about the hot ear from holding a cell phone up to their head. Some people talk about humming and stuff, tinnitus that goes on with all of that too. But itching skin, rashes, flushing, nerve damage, nerve sensitivity from having these devices too close to us. And then all of our poor organs, you know, our heart is one of our biggest ones. We know that we are biologically, chemically, and electrical beings, which is why we do EEGs and EKGs to measure how appropriate is the electrical circuitry in our body. Well, when we start overpowering ourselves with these man-made pulsations, then we see these irregular heartbeats. Maybe you're getting palpitations. Maybe you're getting an arrhythmia. Maybe your blood pressure is going too high or too low, depending on your own individual proclivity. So some people describe it like they can't breathe. It feels like somebody's sitting on their chest. And then cognitive impairment, where we just can't remember what it was that we were meant to be doing. And then at the EMF medical conference, one of the most heartbreaking things I heard a couple of the doctors and scientists call out is that if we don't get ahead of this, we can expect many more of these outbursts in society, like we're having with anger, like we're having with mass shootings, because we are biologically changing the gray matter and the white matter of the brain in the very areas where we would develop executive function and other important developments that we as humans really need. We are damaging that. And if we don't stop exposing ourselves to microwaves, we can expect to see a lot more of that. I know here in Boston, and maybe it's the same where you are, but when the kids went back to school after the pandemic, after we had issued them these Chromebooks or other tablets with no safety instruction, now they've been at home and locked down for how many hours a day on a radiating device. Now they come back into the schools, and we know that it's capable of causing brain effects. We had 3 different school districts in the news in Boston where the kids literally were pounding on their classmates with a Chromebook because they could not modulate their behavior. And I was talking to somebody at a yoga class one day, and turns out she was a teacher in a neighboring town. She was, oh my gosh, one of my colleagues is out on disability because one of the boys beat her up with a Chromebook. So it's happening right now, you guys. There is no cavalry coming. It's up to you and I to do our very best. And even pre-pandemic, we were literally at epidemic levels of anxiety, depression, suicide ideation among children and adults like we've never seen before. So with great thanks to Libby Kelly and her colleagues, they have put together a group of world-leading scientists. These are the scientific experts who have done the studies, the non-industry funded studies. And they just recently came out with this statement from their organization, which is the International Commission on the Biological Effects of Electromagnetic Fields. They now have this statement on electromagnetic hypersensitivity crisis. I looked at that statement and I read it out loud, and it took me about 5 minutes to read out loud. And I think that would be a really good thing to take to your local meetings with your town, with your schools, and read that statement aloud. If you're only allowed 2 minutes or 3 minutes at a public meeting, get a buddy and each of you can take time to read that. But that's a wonderful new tool that we have in our toolbox now. So my big head scratcher was if little me can go out there and just start looking for the science and find it like that, surely somebody's got to have our backs on this. So why don't we know? And it wasn't until 2015 when Harvard's Law School Center for Ethics came out with this incredible free online report called Captured Agency, how the Federal Communications Commission is dominated by the industries it presumably regulates. So Captured Agency, and look at the graphic they chose for the cover of their report. It's a revolving door, and that is what many, many of our federal agencies have become today, is a mouthpiece for industry. So they get in there, they take over the agency, and then they pass laws that will protect their interest instead of what they're supposed to be doing, which is protecting the public and public health. So that's a really good report for people who are like, oh no, the FCC says it's fine. Well, the FCC is a captured agency, and others have done reporting on this over the years. And sadly, this conflict of interest goes all the way up to the World Health Organization, who would know that there are two groups at the World Health Organization who work on these electromagnetic fields of radio frequency? One of them was the actual qualified scientists and doctors, and the other is a self-appointed group that has heavy ties to industry. Now, after our $30 million study came out showing clear evidence of cancers and DNA damage, and the Ramazzini Institute came out with their findings of the same thing, then the World Health Organization was made to open up a new investigation. And that gave us hope for about a split second until we saw that they stacked it with industry people again. So if you go to this link here, this goes to Dr. Joel Moskowitz at the University of California, Berkeley School of Public Health, and he has tracked all of the history with the World Health Organization and the corruption that's going on there as well. So just know that the industry has deep pockets and deep hooks into just about everybody who's got a hand in public policy. So again, there's no cavalry coming. If we want to have a healthy society, I think it's got to come from the grassroots up, which is what we're hoping to help with the education on here. So we talked about our own devices a little bit. Another exposure that you may or may not have control over are these cell towers. And again, it's critically important to look at the non-industry funded studies because industry will spin it like, oh, we're well within compliance with the FCC limits. Those were set back in the 90s to allow this much radiation. And all that science is now showing the harm is at hundreds of thousands of times below what the industry and the FCC still allowed. So I got way in over my head on this, and I couldn't remember where I had found good things that I later wanted to cross-reference or share with other people. So being a tech writer, I just created my own research repository, and I called it Understanding EMFs because I didn't understand what EMFs were. But I have some of the peer-reviewed studies here that show if you have a cell tower within like 1,540 feet or 500 meters of your place, there is a much higher risk of death, neurotoxicity with all the insomnia, the headaches, the nosebleeds, the nausea, the dizziness, all of that. And that is where the curve starts coming down at that 500-meter mark. It doesn't actually catch up to, standard statistics for the population to almost double that. So in these studies, they're called epidemiological studies. That means what's actually happening out in science versus what's happening in a lab or what's happening in a body, what's happening out in our world. So the epidemiological studies recommend a very minimum 500 meters or 1,640 feet. Here in the US, there's a website called antennasearch.com, and you are more than welcome to go pop any address in your home or your office or your kids' schools, and it will give you a 3-mile radius of how many cell towers are in the vicinity or how many macro cell antennas. And oftentimes the cell tower has the macro or the big, tall, antennas mounted on them. But industry put something in the law that, hey, if we can make it look aesthetically pleasing, we can put them anywhere unless you have zoning code that prohibits it. So now when we look around, and I apologize because you may not look at your world the same again, but you'll see them mounted on buildings or on the rooftops, painted the same color, because aesthetically, if they can paint it the same color, then oftentimes they think they can get away with it. So I put in the address of the State House in Boston. And within 3 miles of our State House in downtown Boston, there were more than 1,500 cell towers. And mind you, these signals go out for miles. And more than 4,500 of these massive antennas. That's what this little map is. And then I zoomed in on one neighborhood in Hyde Park in Boston. And look at this residential neighborhood. How many of these big cell antennas and towers are right there? And then you add on 5G. So 5G means 5th generation technology. We have 3G, 3rd generation, 4G, 4th generation. About every 10 years, we get into a new generation of technology. Our friends in Hawaii at Safe Tech Hawaii, or the equivalent of that, they've got a good little short, maybe 6-minute video here on what 5G is and isn't. You're welcome to look at that. But the way they're getting it out to market is to promise faster entertainment speeds, smart cities, superhighways, all this really sexy sounding, fun, cool stuff, without telling us the risks. And if you look a little closer, you'll see that as they're pushing all these streaming services, that these parent companies that own the telecom industry are also buying out the entertainment industry. So this is another revenue stream. And what's left to monetize are these short little millimeter waves. Right now, your 3G or 4G signals are long pulsing waves that are coming in, and they can, because they're these bigger waves, they can get through objects like your house to your device. But 5G uses these tiny little millimeter waves that can get dysregulated by things in its path, like a tree or rain or snow. So 5G doesn't fly into itself. It's got to have this backbone of the other longer waves. So we've got this whole jumble bumble of all these different frequencies coming at us with 5G. And with thanks to Patti and Doug, here's a graphic from their Americans for Responsible Technology website that shows what some of these thimble-looking things are up on poles, but we also know that they hang them on the wires. Could be something like this. We have reports of them going in under manhole covers. So again, having a meter in hand and knowing how to measure is pretty important here. And then 5G adds into that soup, and their goal, because these little tiny millimeter waves don't go very far, they want to put these every 2 to 12 houses, not in industrial parks where they started with the cell towers, but inside your neighborhood, at the curb, in the public access way. And we're already seeing them go in many, many communities. And they're targeting our schools. And they're using fear tactics for that. Like, oh, if there's a shooter, you're going to want to make sure your kid can call you. Well, first of all, if there's a shooter in the building, the last thing you want is a kid on a cell phone. You want that child paying attention to the responsible adults who are going to keep them safe. When the crisis is over, then the teachers and administrators will give the kids the phones and give it back so that they can contact their families and let them know they're safe. So, but the industry will say, oh, you should have cell towers all over your school, right? But heck no, it's a carcinogen you're putting on your kid's school. And then at this era of climate change, our cities are now focusing on growing the tree canopies to cool the cities in the hot summer months, and industries coming in and just clear cutting those trees so they can get their dinky little millimeter signals to go through to connect with your 5G device. And here's a couple of kickers. Senator Richard Blumenthal from Connecticut, he was at a congressional hearing with the Commerce Committee, and he said to these two industry leaders, so please share with us, how much money have you invested in independent, peer-reviewed, published science before you brought 5G to market? And these two guys just kind of humming it and ultimately said, well, we don't really know of any independent science that's been done. So Senator Blumenthal says, so as far as health and safety are concerned, we're flying blind here. But that's what they do. Throw it out there, ask questions later. That's their MO. And even Computer World and others are saying 5G is a big joke. It's a marketing term, and we're not even getting faster speeds than what we already had with toxic 4G. So that's what 5G is. So in the back of my slides, you will find additional materials after we wrap up today and I send out my slides. There's also a slide on utility smart meters. That's another source of microwave radiation emissions. So it's the meters that have been mounted on our homes for electrical, solar, gas, water, propane maybe. And that's important to know too, and we can learn about that another time. But we want to give you guys hope, because as bleak as this sounds, you do have control over a lot of your technology. So on the back of your router somewhere, there are Ethernet ports. All you need to do is hook a wire back up. If you're going to buy a new Ethernet cable, get one that says it's shielded That just means it's got a foil liner around the wires inside the casing, and that prevents another man-made form of electromagnetic field, dirty electricity that can often pulse into your living spaces 6 or 8 feet from the wall. So if you're going to buy a new cable, get a shielded one. And then most of us have multiple devices today. So you can get something that's like a little extension box for electronics. It's called the Ethernet switch, and they're little, just plugs into the wall for electricity. And then you plug your main Ethernet cable into one port, and then get a little Ethernet cable for each one of your devices. And then every one of those holes in that box gives you a direct connection to the internet. So your signal is going to be far better than anything you're ever going to get buckshotting your signal through the air with microwaves. So get individual cables for each of your devices. Who knew, but you can buy little adapters for your tablets and your phones. Plug it all in, and then you're hardwired. The second step is to go back now into each device, as well as your router, identify and turn off those microwave radiating antennas. And you can call your internet service provider. Mine just said, yeah, sit down at your computer, you'll walk you through it. And I was like, really? And I just went into my account online with Verizon or Comcast, whoever I was with at the time. And they told me how to get into my account, how to go into settings for wireless. And then I just turned off those antennas. And it would say things like, well, you realize you're cutting off everyone's Wi-Fi. And I'm like, yes, thank you. And then I waited a few minutes for it to dissipate in my home. And then I went down to my utility closet where my router is. Again, as much distance from any of this stuff as you can is advisable. And I measured, and it was radio silence, literally. So we can control this, but you really do need to measure because, like I said, they want to put 200 wireless devices in our homes for 5G and the Internet of Things, and they're sneaky. My printer over here behind me, I was in my office one day working, and all of a sudden it just felt like the earth was sucking me down again, and I didn't know why. I've never felt good under man-made fluorescent lights, and that's kind of what I was feeling, like some man-made energy. Well, my daughter had been home and asked if she could turn on the printer and use it wirelessly. And I said, yeah, just make sure you turn it off as soon as you're done using the wireless connection. And the little glow plate on the front of the printer wasn't glowing with the Wi-Fi, but I took out my meter and sure enough, it was off the charts again. So I looked up the manual online and I found out there were 3 antennas in that one printer, and only one of them was connected to that glow plate with the Wi-Fi logo. So all I had to do was punch around in the settings and find those antennas and just turn them off and then measure again. Same thing with our new stove. Our old one, may it rest in peace, we wore it to the ground. And the new one had smart technology in it. And so I looked in the manual. First, I looked in the settings. There was nothing in there that would allow me to disable it. And when I measured how much radiation was coming off of that thing, it was 1,090,000 microwatts per square meter. And we want it to be at 10 or less in our living spaces. So long story short, I wound up having to call the company, and they sent a tech out, and he'd never heard of any of this, and he was a little grumpy with me. So he had to contact an engineer and found out that when you pull off the back of the stove behind the motherboard, or behind the digital display is the motherboard, and connected to that was this little tiny board that was the radio frequency antenna. And all he had to do was unplug it. And I measured again, and I was back down into the safer zone in my home. I did the same thing with my television. There was nothing in the settings, nothing the manufacturer could help me with, but it had a radio frequency antenna in it that I couldn't turn off. So I just picked up my big TV and I put it in my car and I drove it down to the local tech guy, and I paid him $80 and he pulled this out. You know, so it's not rocket science. This, meet the enemy. This is the antenna, this little board. So that's all we're talking about, is a little chunk of technology that we can just learn to take and disable, and then still use our technology safely. So in a classroom, here's what safe technology looks like. And thank you to Patti for providing us with these graphics from her website at techsafeschools.org. And so all you have to do is plug in the Ethernet cables and the adapters. This is a device that is like one of these Ethernet switches, but it looks like a spider or a ladybug. Makes it more fun for the kids, but just at desk level, you just plug everything back in. And every one of those wireless access points that are mounted on the ceiling of the classroom, go take a close look, because on the underbelly of them, they have 2 Ethernet ports. So your schools are probably 90% hardwired already. All you have to do is make that final connection, because they've got cables that come to the building. They've got cables that go to the systems in the school. And then they've got cables that go to those wireless access points. And now you got to do is drop another Ethernet cable down to the desk level, and students can access all the technology they need without being radiated once we turn off all the antennas. And so, as Patti was discussing earlier, there's another really easy thing. So she mentioned that when our IT departments get all the equipment, it comes full tilt from the industry in the box. So highest power level you can have, right? Because everyone's been conditioned, more is better, right? But you can take that down, that power level, 90+%, and still get a good connection if you have to do something wirelessly. You can put your wireless on timers and stuff so that it's not pulsating all the time. So in the next couple of minutes, I want to give everybody hope, because there's so much that we can do. And Martin Luther King Jr. taught us that when we have really important things finally change in our society, it comes through 3 channels. 1, the public gets informed and decides to do something about it. That's what we're hoping to inspire today. 2, it goes through the courts and the guilty are held accountable, in this case, the wireless industry. And 3, public policy ultimately gets enacted. In this case, that may happen when public policy catches up to the science. So I'll let you pound around in my slides to look at these things in more detail, but I at least want to point out some of the highlights. So with the legal solutions, the Environmental Health Trust, Children's Health Defense, and others sued the FCC because 11,000 pages of evidence of harm had been entered into the public record. So it's in there legally, and they completely ignored it and went and stuck with their 1996 public radiation exposure limits before we had all this ubiquitous radiation that we're now immersed in today. The Environmental Health Trust and Children's Health Defense worked tirelessly and spent thousands of dollars to pull together the public record for these 3 judges, and they presented them with 27 big fat binders full of the facts. And the judges are looking at the facts and saying to the attorneys for the FCC, so how did you determine in the face of all this evidence that you're going to stick with those 1996 guidelines that are only based on how much heat is coming from a device? That's all our FCC limits account for, is heat. But the science that they were looking at were clearly showing, those studies were clearly showing, you don't have to have heat. There's significant damage happening at hundreds of thousands of times below those terrible limits that the FCC stands behind. So at the end of the day, the attorneys for the FCC went, well, the FDA said it's okay. So of course the judges asked, where's the homework from the FDA? And there is none, because not one of our federal agencies has done the responsible review of radio frequency biological effects. So the judges ordered the FCC to go back and revisit their public radiation exposure limits. And it's now been 3 years. The court did not give them a deadline. It's now been 3 years, and the FCC has done nothing to protect you and I. Just like the World Health Organization is doing nothing to protect you and I. So we have had lawsuits all over. We just got news this week that a lawsuit that's been going on out in Pittsfield, Massachusetts, where Verizon illegally sited a cell tower on top of this neighborhood. Their Board of Health deemed that radiation was so toxic that their homes were uninhabitable. It made 17 children and adults so sick they had to abandon their homes. One gentleman who didn't leave just passed away from cancer. And when they opened him up, he was just riddled with tumors all throughout his body. So there was a lawsuit in Pittsfield, with great thanks to Children's Health Defense, to get Verizon to move that cell tower. And the Board of Health wrote a cease and desist order saying, Verizon, you've got 7 days, come to the table, let's sit down and figure this out. Well, at the 11th hour, Verizon, doing what Verizon does, went to the courts and said, we don't think they have a leg to stand on. We don't think that Board of Health can tell us what to do. So they put an injunction against a Board of Health, which really is brazen, because anybody will respect what a Board of Health jurisdiction is. But we're dealing with the largest industries in the world, and they honestly do not care at all about your health or mine. So there was a lawsuit to remove that injunction and allow that Board of Health to do its job. And we just found out that the judge on this case threw it back to the FCC to figure it out, which was very sad. But we think Children's Health Defense will appeal that decision and take it to a higher court. For the first time in the United States, a court here in Massachusetts recognized that you don't have to have heat to have harm. So we know that these lawsuits build off of each other. So all of these firsts are really important. And back here in Pittsfield, for the first time in the United States, a Board of Health investigated, and the state level legal authorities, the Massachusetts Association of Health Boards, they put a statement into the court saying, we want to back up these citizens and we want to back up the Board of Health. But who knows who's connected to whom and why people do what they do. But there are many, many lawsuits happening all over the world, but we don't hear about it in mainstream media because mainstream media is by and large owned by these companies, or their advertising revenue is so potent that they will not report on this issue. So please go ahead and look around. Children's Health Defense, literally a team of attorneys trying to protect our kids from all sorts of environmental pollutants. They have a radiation team now, and they are bringing in lawsuits and testing out theories that they might succeed in. So that's the legal, and then there's public policy. So I mentioned that we got a law passed in New Hampshire in just 7 months' time to investigate this. And Representative Patrick Abrami had a constituent, Deb Hodgson, in New Hampshire, who taught him about this issue. And he was an engineer. And of course, our engineers and physicists and technologists have only been taught that you have to have heat to have harm. So this flew right in the face of everything Representative Patrick Abrami ever knew. But he's a good man, and he went and started reading the science and had this major wow moment, like, wow, what are we doing here? So Deb and Rep. Abrami got in his car and drove down from New Hampshire. We sat at my kitchen table for an afternoon, and we helped him to connect the dots further. And he beefed up his bill with very pointed questions. Why have Lloyd's of London and Swiss Re and AM Best and others long since recognized this man-made radiation is a world-leading risk? And they put exclusions in their policies. So our communities are not protected because the industry doesn't have insurance on this. And the legal fine print, we talked about that at the beginning of our talk. Why is the FCC ignoring all this science? Why are they not looking at the non-thermal effects? And why do they allow 100 times more radiation than certain other countries allow? And why is nobody looking at this cumulative effect? We want to be at 10 or less microwatts per square meter. My single phone threw us over 2 million. What are we doing to our children in the classrooms when we've got 20 or 30 radiating devices, plus their cell phones, plus their wearables, plus the wireless access point, plus the smart board and the mini? We are harming our children, and nobody's coming to fix it except for you and I. So within a year, we got this groundbreaking report done, documenting all the conflicts of interest with the industry and our federal agencies, and making 15 recommendations to educate and protect the public and get wireless out of our public spaces and our schools. Dr. Kent Chamberlain from the University of New Hampshire, He did a great 20-minute presentation on this, and he provides his slides if you think your municipality or your schools would benefit from that. But beyond my slides in the back end, when you get them, you'll see other bills in other states all around the country. But let's talk for a few minutes now about the schools. So I took my meter and I took my cell phone and I went to an open house at our beautiful new David Mendez Elementary School. And I started taking measurements in the parking lot. And unless somebody walked by with a phone, it was in the nice green readings on this safe and sound calibrated certified meter. Every single room in that new beautiful building was electropolluted. The gym had the lowest readings because the ceilings are so high in a gymnasium, but it was still not green. As I went into each of the classrooms with the lower and the hallways with the lower ceilings, red, 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 red. And they have put a wireless access point in every single classroom. And they don't even use wireless tech very much at this elementary school. But that radiation is pulsing unless they've since taken a look at it and measured and come down with that. So you can go to this link and see real live readings. And mind you, this was on a Saturday. We didn't have kids in the building using devices. This was just the infrastructure that is what is in most of our schools today. So what are Silicon Valley executives doing? Well, New York Times did a 3-part expose years ago that showed that they're sending their children to schools with no tech, not wireless, not wired. They know that a child does not properly develop in front of a screen. They need tactile touch with their environment. They need movement to properly develop their brains. They need connections with their peers. They need eye contact with their trusted adults. They need to be out in nature, not sitting in the shallows of a screen. And New York Times executives are going so far as to have their nannies sign contracts that there will be no screens around their children while they pump all this out to our kids. Dr. Holly Grow is a corneal surgeon. She got other medical specialists together for heart and lifestyle, and they got a unanimous bill passed into law in Louisiana to start addressing best practices for digital device, because the industry won. They wanted a one-to-one device in the hands of all of our children, and they won. Now it's time to come back from the pendulum and bring it back to the middle and say, we're in charge of the technology. It's not our master. We're in charge of it. So let's come up with best practices to make sure those kids are getting their social interaction, their emotional supports, that they're out in nature, that they're physically moving around, and let's start addressing the wireless. The state of Maryland has a fact sheet recommending hardwired tech. The country of Cyprus sent home safe technology recommendations when they gave their kids tablets during the pandemic. We didn't give any instruction to American children. The Netherlands, Finland, and others are now taking tech out of the schools because it is a disruptor. It is not helping the outcomes. It's fun and it's cool, and it might be a babysitter for the kids, but it is not improving the outcomes. In fact, it's denigrating the outcomes. And as we know now, we see story after story now that many are starting to ban cell phones during the school day and during the activities at the end of the school day. And this is the perfect opportunity to open up the conversation to say, congratulations, thank you for recognizing that this is such a distraction to our learning environment and that the kids are going through bullying, and these cell phones don't belong, the wearables don't belong in the school setting. So with great thanks to Brenda Martinez in Los Angeles that Patty mentioned early on, and to Patty and her husband Doug, Sydney Cox, who's with us today, she's a retired school teacher, and a couple other retired school teachers. We all worked together and came up with this letter. Great thanks to Doug for being the lead author on that. But it's a letter to the Los Angeles Unified School District saying, bravo and congratulations for planning to take the cell phones out of the school environment come January. Please store them safely. Do not just put them all in the back of the classroom, all radiating for these poor kids to get, exposed to. But please store them responsibly with the antennas turned off, and then make your way after that first step to learning how to truly have safe technology in our schools. So that letter is there for anybody to share. We can customize that with you as well. So what are the solutions? Now that we know what all these great risks are, what can we do? So with great thanks to Dr. Tony Stein and others, she worked with the U.S. Collaborative for High Performance Schools, and some of our schools know that this is a green certifying organization. And Dr. Stein came up with a low EMF best practices that address that dirty electricity we talked to, but also the radio frequency radiation. So there is a module that's available through that program. And then with great thanks to Patty and Doug, we have this Tech Safe Schools national program now that will teach all of our schools what the science is, what the risks are, both physiologically, psychologically, and legally. We don't want our schools getting sued because people are getting sick and they are allowing all of this radiation to, pulsate in there. We want to help protect them proactively. So they have mitigation strategies in there. Patty's got this really great 1-minute video at the opening remarks here. And then the Massachusetts Breast Cancer Coalition has kindergarten through grade 12 curriculum on prevention already set up. So we know how to do this, but we can't do it for you. We can support you, but it's going to take you speaking to your community. Don't go to the authorities first. One voice, that was my hard lesson learned. One voice is very easily swept under the rug when the industry got such a head start on us. So we will teach you how to get everybody around you educated, your family, the parents of the kids that hang out with, the grandparents, the guardians. Let's get a good core group educated in your community, and then together we can go start presenting to the schools. Dr. Alexia McKnight is a veterinary radiologist, and she wound up getting really sick from the smart meter that was mounted on her home, to the point she got so neurotoxic that she couldn't remember whether that green light out in traffic meant stop or go. And she had her daughter in the car with her. By some miracle, she found her way home without incident, but that's how bad it is. So she brought me in, and we did 4 sessions for professional development in her children's schools in Pennsylvania. So we know how to do this. We know how to deliver the training, but we need everybody's help in getting us in front of the decision makers. And then here's that little course that we have that can be completed online in an hour. And then our friends at the Environmental Health Trust have just a wealth of fact sheets, trainings, the science, all of it there at the Environmental Health Trust, how to protect our kids at the college level in the dorms as well. And man, that virtual reality of putting a cell phone up to the brain, really bad idea for our schools to buy into that. And just know there are solutions at every level for our healthcare practitioners. We've got the medical conference at no charge. We have the first medical school textbook now. And now there's a nursing school textbook as well with a chapter on this. And for all of our technologists, we have it there. Go look at these resources. Okay. So next steps. Let's continue learning together. We will be having these webinars twice a month, so please check us out at Massachusetts for Safe Technology. And toward the end of the month, we announce the dates for the next month. And we always list our recordings from prior webinars that we've done, so you can always access the information and my slides. And then The Anxious Generation is another of the latest book of psychologists and psychiatrists coming out and saying, look, we are trashing our kids today. Dr. Jonathan Haidt from New York University came out with this book recently that's gotten a lot of media attention. And although he doesn't address the radio frequency radiation, he does a really good job of saying how we have rewired our kids' childhood when we gave them these cell phones starting back in 2012. You know, how the great rewiring of childhood is causing an epidemic of mental illness. So there's so much we can do, but we need to learn. Dr. Victoria Dunkley came out with this book a number of years ago, and she has a 4-week protocol in there to week 1, educate everybody around your child that you're going to be doing a digital detox to reset your child's brain and make sure that your child is not going to be allowed to slip off down to the neighbor's house and get his little fix on whatever down there. But then for 3 weeks, you know, we get back to active parenting. We set up activities. We get together as a family. We get off our own screens and learn to role model good technology behavior and hygiene with our children. And as scary as it sounds, time and again, at the end of this 4-week period, the child is back to their normal, sweet self. The family dynamics have vastly improved, and everybody is back in control of their own lives. So we know. And Katie Singer she put out a book called The Invisible Silent Spring some years ago, and she's a journalist, and she just wrote a really wonderful article featuring the work of a pediatrician out in California, Dr. Toril Gelter. And Dr. Gelter's protocol here for creating that sleep sanctuary is given in detail. So we invite everybody to look at that as well. And who knew, but Camilla Reese, Dr. Erica Mallory Blythe, and others worked with PBS, and Bert Wolf's travel show has 2 half-hour episodes. That's something you can sit down and watch with your loved ones. This award-winning film, Generation Zapped, came out in 2018, and it's a really good film, 72 minutes, and it teaches us the risks. And then in these webinars that we do, we take you from 2018 when that film was released and bring you up to speed with what's going on today. But that's still a really good thing to sit down, invite all your friends over into your neighborhood, into your living room, or rent the room or just get the room at the library, and watch this together. And I can be brought in to do Q&A at the end if you'd like. But it's still a really good tool to teach with. And then folks have complimented me on this EMF points of confusion versus fact sheet. I got the idea for this when Dr. Joel Moskowitz did a similar thing on that $30 million study with the National Toxicology Program. But just a few pages of quick bullet points that you can look at. You know, I'm confused about this because the FCC says it's fine. I'm confused about this because our schools brought wireless in. You know, whatever these points of confusion are, here's the facts. You can drill down into them very quickly. And sometimes if we, you know, try to be a good doobie and try and share this information with others, they've only heard from industry. They may be addicted. It does biologically hit the same receptors in our central nervous system as drugs and alcohol and tobacco and all of that. So they physiologically truly may be addicted. But for many reasons, people they won't listen. They don't want to hear it. So if we can gently provide the facts, I'm told that this fact sheet has been very helpful. So you can just post that up on social media. I have people who say, I keep a stack of them, and whenever I open this conversation, I just hand it to people, and then they start learning about it. And then here's all these episodes that I have at our cable station. So please use these resources and consider yourself lucky, because we didn't have them a decade ago. So we do this for you because there's no cavalry coming. So I'm cooking up a program right now. I want to invite 10 champions in 10 different towns, US, Canada, Europe, wherever. Let's see what happens if we truly take this grassroots. Let's get the community education out there first. We'll come up with a flyer, and literally grassroots, we'll go to the schools, to the open house, and we'll stand outside and we'll pass it out to the parents as they come in the building. Maybe we go to the sporting events, maybe we go to the drama events, and we just get information into the hands of the parents, the grandparents, and the community members. And then we include a date for a forum that they can come to learn some more. And then once we have a good core group of people who have done their homework and really maybe even measured their own devices, Then we can reach out to the schools. And I have gotten a small grant, and I've worked with Rob Metzinger, who owns Safe Living Technologies, who makes this Safe and Sound Pro 2. And he has offered me a discount. So if we can get 10 communities, and I think I'm up to 4 or 5 right now, so there's still time to join us, we will get you a meter. If you already have one, great. If at the end of this project, we would like to see it donated to the community so that everybody can borrow it, either through the schools or through your library. But we'll make sure that you have a meter, because it's critically important, because seeing is believing for everybody you're going to talk to. And then we'll have our own support system, right? You'll have a support system in your community, because burnout is very real. So we want to be able to keep each other afloat with this. And then our 10 communities will meet on a periodic basis, compare notes, see what's working, see what we can do differently. And we'll do these strategy meetings, and we'll celebrate for every inroad that we get. A foot in the door, we'll celebrate, because we want to have fun, right? Patty and Doug always talk about, let's make this fun, because we're going to do it anyway, so we might as well make it fun. So please reach out to me if you want to be one of the child safety champions on this project, and we're going to kick it off this fall. Get everybody settled back into the school year, and then we're going to kick it off. So thank you. Thank you for joining us. If you want to reach out, here's my email, here's Patty's email, here's our websites. And please don't just wait for somebody else, because there's no cavalry coming, and our kids are relying on us to keep them safe. So again, at the end of this, there's a lot more, well, about a dozen more slides on other topics that we touched on that you can do the deeper dive in. So you are more than welcome to pound around after we send our slides out today or tomorrow. And I will stop sharing and invite Patty back if she was able to stay with us. Let's see, she may have had to drop off early. So I will go ahead and open it up. If anybody would like to raise their hand, if they have any questions, we've got about 12 minutes left. We would be honored to answer any questions that you might have. Okay, barring that, I want to wish everybody a tech-safe day. Reach out if you'd like to be a champion in your community, and look for the slides, the recording, and have a tech-safe day, everybody. Take care. Bye-bye.